Well, you know, in the current days in France, but also beyond France, given the rise of powerful racist, xenophobic movements, political leaders, a few months before the upcoming presidential election in France, any promotion of a black person, such as Josephine Baker, is good news in many ways. The fact that a black woman born in the United States who fought for the human rights, who fought fascism at the cost of her own physical life sometimes, is something that is good news in current day France, I think.
Qui est affilié de tout temps à nos théâtres. Ils ont des affiches de spectacles partout dans leur salle. Et on va demander à Josephine Baker de retirer son haut, de danser à moitié nue. On va leur proposer la danse sauvage pour quelque chose de très sensuel, très suave, parce qu'on veut susciter le scandale. Finalement, le bad buzz, ça existe déjà à cette époque-là, et on veut un bad buzz pour le buzz tout court. Et c'est vraiment cette volonté qui va amener Joséphine à susciter un scandale de salle et un scandale des cœurs aussi, parce que s'il y a des gens scandalisés dans la salle, c'est avant tout le public féminin. Le public masculin, lui, n'est pas trop scandalisé par Josephine Baker, au contraire, il est immédiatement charmé. Josephine Baker va représenter tous les fantasmes de cette époque-là. C'est un regard très colonialiste qu'on va poser sur elle, un regard très condescendant, mais pas aussi raciste que ce qu'elle a pu connaître aux États-Unis. Et c'est pour ça qu'elle va tolérer ce regard, qu'elle va jouer avec et qu'elle va accepter de se dénuder, parce que ce n'est pas le même regard qu'on va poser sur elle. Ce n'est pas se dénuder sur la scène du théâtre des Champs-Élysées, ce n'est pas un pas vers la prostitution. Ça va être un pas vers le succès.
She was controversial at that time. Many activists, anti-colonial activists, also considered that Josephine Baker was playing in the sense of colonization, the propaganda for colonization which we have around us, that she was singing the song that the French wanted her to sing. So she was quite criticized at that time. But let's not forget that when she arrived in France, she was only 19 years old. She was almost illiterate. She didn't have any political consciousness. So she had to build her political and racial consciousness. And it took some time in the 1930s and later on. So this is also a process through which she became more and more aware of herself, aware of the human rights she was defending. So we are talking about a woman who grew, politically speaking, while in France. So she was part of a whole generation of people who moved to France. Now, it does not mean that racism did not exist in France. But the French racism has often been more subtle, not as brutal as the American forms of racism. And African Americans, in any case, as James Baldwin would later remark in the 1950s, were somehow protected from the worst kinds of anti-black racism because they were Americans. They were black, but they were also Americans. So they were in a higher position than the Africans or the West Indians, who also lived by the thousands in France. And Josephine Baker and others were perfectly aware of their ambiguous racial position in France, being halfway, so to speak, between Africans and Americans. They were aware that French racism did exist. They were aware of the French Empire and the brutalities of French colonization, for sure, but they were also having a better life overall in France than the one they had left behind in the United States.